Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are happy to welcome Fonda Lee and Sarah Gailey. Fonda Lee is the World Fantasy Award-winning author of the Green Bone Saga and the YA science fiction novels Zero Boxer, Exo, and Crossfire. In Fonda Lee's Jade Legacy, the page-turning conclusion to the Green Bone Saga, the Kaul siblings battle rival clans for honor and control over an East Asia-inspired fantasy metropolis. They must discern allies from enemies, set aside bloody rivalries, and make terrible sacrifices. But even the unbreakable bonds of blood and loyalty may not be enough to ensure the survival of the Green Bone clans and the nation they are sworn to protect. Lee will be joined in conversation with Sarah Gailey, Hugo Award-winning author of Magic for Liars and The Echo Wife. So this evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, as well as if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, consider supporting Fonda and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. A link to buy Jade Legacy along with Sarah's books will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. So Fonda and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Powell's, for hosting us. In the time that I was fortunate enough to live in Portland, I got to visit Powell's an awful lot, and it's just great. Strong recommend. You can buy lots of books there, especially all 3 books now in the Green Bone Saga, which is, I am not even a little bit self-conscious to say, one of my favorite series of all time. Easily like bury me with it books. Fonda, I'm so excited and honored to be getting to talk to you about the last book in the series tonight.
I'm super excited to have you with me because, as I recall, you were one of the first people to read Jade City when it was an arc, and you got it before it was published, and this was well before advanced reviews started coming in, and I still remember being all like kind of nervous about the first book coming out, and you texted me with like just shrieking enthusiasm when at a time that I really needed it. And so I'm just really glad to have you here to talk to me about it at the end. And it feels like 1,000 years have passed.
I mean, I think that they have. It's been a very, very, very long few years. But I'm so delighted. It feels like I'm watching a kid I used to babysit graduate high school, seeing these books come to the end of their series, and not just because each one weighs as much as a small child. I feel like I have been watching the Kaul family grow this whole time and being like, oh my gosh, how are they gonna do? Are my babies okay? And I'm super excited to talk about this with you. Do you want to go ahead and just should we dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Get into it?
Yeah.
The first thing, and I mentioned this to you already. I'm going to tell our audience too. We're trying to avoid spoilers because this is the 3rd book in a series. So we're going to be talking a lot about the series as a whole, but I personally have tried to avoid even thinking of any questions that would cause spoilers to come out. Apologies in advance if they do, but we're going to try and shoot to be talking more about the trilogy as a whole tonight for anyone who hasn't completely blasted through reading the last book the way that I did the second I had it in my greedy little paws. So Fonda, the Green Bone Saga obviously is a brilliant generational narrative about organized crime, about families who have access to magic that is activated by bioenergetic jade, very specific to the island that they live on, Kekon. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about influences. The most obvious influence that I can see, which is part of what made me immediately fall head over heels for these books, is The Godfather. Problematic fave. If you are in the audience and you have not read The Godfather, don't. It's not a it's not a good book, but it's one of my favorite books. And obviously I can see that in the DNA of this entire trilogy. I'm curious about what other influences you brought into this incredibly complicated, beautiful narrative.
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. The Godfather DNA is in there, along with a lot of other mobster mafia stories like The Untouchables and Goodfellas and Martin Scorsese films and all of that. And then also mashed together with a lot of crime drama from Eastern cinema tradition. So Infernal Affairs and Election and the John Woo, Chow Yun-fat action movies and Yakuza films like Battles Without Honor and Humanity. So that whole genre on like both sides of the world fed in to the vibes of this book. And also epic fantasy and urban fantasy traditions, as well as kung fu flicks and wuxia genre fiction. So I just took a lot of things that I thought were cool that I wanted to mash together and build something out of. It really was like, okay, let me take all these ingredients and see if I can alchemically combine them in a way that feels organic and original.
In my experience, that's one of the most fun ways to write. And I always I personally scramble a little bit when readers are like, let's talk about the intricacies of why you made all the choices that you made, because a lot of times for me, the real answer is, I thought it would be cool.
Yeah.
I just thought it would be cool. I had to remove something from a book that I was in the middle of editing because it was so nakedly obvious that I was just like, that's neat. And my editor was like, why is this happening in this story? And I was like, oh, I can't justify that one. That said, I am going to do that thing of asking you a lot of questions about why you made the choices you made.
It's okay, because as we both know, you can always rationalize things after the fact. So I'm very
absolutely
good at that.
I'm excited to see the well-considered backflip.
Yes.
I love that you married epic fantasy scope in a story to the kind of more contemporary crime narrative, which tends to be very narrow. A lot of even the Godfather, like overarching crime family stories that I really love, do still have a tendency to be pretty narrow. They're very focused on one family and the internal dynamics of that family, where throughout the Green Bone Saga, you really expanded this to fill an entire world, multiple governments, in a very epic fantasy way. I'm curious how you went about bringing those two parts of your brain together, because when I try to bring those two parts of my brain together, they shoot off like magnets with the wrong poles pointed toward each other.
I think it really is because I'm a world building junkie, and I had a vision for the story that it would be a family saga, and that's the thing that appeals to me about The Godfathers. It's not really a story about gangsters, it's a story about a family. They happen to be gangsters, and that's kind of how I envisioned that this would be a family saga, and they happen to have like magic jade combat abilities. So the heart of the story was very intimate, but because I built a secondary world to house it and a magic system to envelop it, then of course I had to make full use of what I had created, and I had to explore this world and the ramifications of Jade over decades and in international affairs and in different cultures and how it's seen and adopted and the economics of it. And so all of that epic fantasy writer instinct had to be sated. And the way I sated it was through the viewpoint of these characters. So because it was still a family story, the family had to get involved in so many big epic things, and so I could still keep it intimate. And especially in Jade Legacy, that was a constant tightrope walk, because there were these big things that were going on in the world, but they would always be balanced by these smaller domestic moments. So you would have like this big action set piece, or you would have like a big political intrigue scene, and then you would also have these scenes where it's like a parenting moment between one of the characters and their child. And so that was that was just the balance that I always had to keep in mind when I was writing these books, and especially Jade Legacy, was balancing that epic scope with the very personal and the very domestic family aspects of it. And it was at times really, really helpful for me, because oftentimes epic fantasy has a tendency to sprawl out of control. I am certainly not the first fantasy author to be threatened by scope creep. And we all know fantasy series that end up being way longer than the author intended. And the structure of this being a family saga and the focus being the family actually helped me to control that, because I was like, oh, well, I could go explore how Jade is being used in entertainment in this other country and go off on like a long tangent and a subplot there, but I never did, because I always brought it back. And so it helped me to tell it. It actually helped me to tell an epic story in a very disciplined way.
I can absolutely see how that played out, and is yet another one of the ways in which you improved over Mario Puzo's work. Not giving in to the bizarre subplots.
Yeah, these subplots were really bizarre.
I gotta say, when you unpack all of the different pieces of world building that you did for this, it is pretty evident that you have a problem. And we can get you help. We can get you help and turn you into a lazy world builder like me. I really love how you did use the personal aspects of this very epic story to keep it emotionally anchored. And I also, again, without not spoiling anything, not going to, without spoiling anything, I think that in Jade Legacy, as in Jade City and Jade War, you managed to do the trick that I think makes great epic fantasy great, of making the personal influence the global in huge sweeping ways. These people have important personal relationships, but those relationships are in no way separate from their political and whatever the crime version is of political significance. Is it? I mean, I guess technically in Kekon, it's still just political,
significance. Yeah, political
is another thing that I think is fascinating about this series. You either married epic fantasy and crime novels or departed from their classic tropes by making crime an integral part of the governance of the island of Kekon. And I would love to know, was that just a, hey, I think this would be a cool thing? Was that part of your world building process? I would love to know more about that decision, because I'm crazy about it.
It was definitely a world building decision, and it came about for a couple of reasons. The first being that I loved all those crime drama tropes, but I didn't want to tell a story of cops versus criminals. I didn't want there to be a whole police like subplot with undercover cops and all that. So like that wasn't the story that I wanted to tell, and I wanted the cool Jade combat to be very upfront and very visible, not hidden, and just be this integral part of the society. So I basically stripped away the criminal aspect, like the law enforcement side of the stories that I enjoyed, and just focused on the vibes. So I was like, how do I impart these crime drama vibes into an entire society where like that's just the way their society works? And I got to play with this a lot, because how they operate is treated differently in different parts of the world. So in their home country of Kekon, the way the clans are just a legitimate shadow government, essentially. Like they are such a big part of the way the society is organized, and everyone has these clan allegiances, and they used to be part of the resistance movement when the country was occupied by a foreign power, which actually has real life historical roots, because the triads and actually started out as like this nationalistic secret society. And so that sort of that was part of what I was hearkening to with the history of the Green Bone clans. So they have a certain status that's almost royalty in their society, but then they go and operate in these other countries where Jade is banned, and they're dealing with like super like truly illegal organizations like the crews in Espana, or like these gangs in Shotar, like these jade smugglers and just drug smugglers. And so I got to kind of play on both, the whole spectrum of like their activities, from like influencing national policy and laws to like alleyway assassinations, and that like and the whole span of like the most gritty like black market operations to like the highest level of political influence. And that was really fun because I got to span, I got to use all that world building that I talked about, from like the very high level to like the really, really gritty textural stuff.
I love how versatile that decision made the vibes. I mean, and the vibes are like, if you're here and you're watching this and you have not read these books, they are jam-packed with vibes. Like, these aren't pages, these are vibes start to finish. And as someone who loves crime in fiction and who is like pretty sternly opposed to the way that we in a lot of Western contemporary storytelling reinforce the notion of the necessity of a police state, I'm astonished by the way that you threaded the needle of removing the police element from the definition of criminality. And somehow, even though everyone who's operating, well, not everyone who's operating, the people who are operating who are legitimate in Kekon still have all of the feeling of criminals, even when they're at home and doing completely legitimate business,
right?
Which I personally am just a big fan of.
And there's also so much
that
hypocrisy and room for moral flexibility in the way that they operate, because they have a moral code, a very strong historical moral code of Aisho, but they also are in this war with another clan, and they're manipulating criminal class, they're manipulating politicians, they're manipulating the media. And so the ways that they kind of go around the supposed rules is always that was a lot of fun to explore, and that left a lot of like of potentially unexpected moments
that we won't say anything about. The kind of contrast between public rules and private rules are really fascinating in these books. The way that the clans have their internal rules that are sort of just understood, and then there's the rules of society, and sometimes those go together and sometimes they don't, I think really does lend a lot of that sense of unpredictability and vice to very straightforward interactions.
Yeah,
I don't know, I just like it. I am curious about how you approach violence in these books. You are one of the best writers of violence working today.
Oh, thank you. I'm genuinely very flattered by that.
It's just true. And I'm not just saying that because I know that you could take me in a fight. As we have discussed, please don't do it. But you, across your work, you write violence in a very compelling but easy to follow way, right? You're not writing fight scenes that are kind of a mess of chaos where it's just like, I guess people are getting hurt. You bring a lot of narrative tension into the violence that you write. And I want to know more about that craft, not just so I can feed on it and try and be as good at it as you are. How do you approach writing violence into your stories?
I love violence. I mean, in fiction, it's great. I think that I really think of violence as advancing the narrative and not the payoff of narrative, because it sometimes is the payoff, but it is also it should also be character development. I think that those violent moments are often the times when you see the characters in their kind of rawest form, if you will. And I have honestly just pulled from my own love of action scenes and my background in martial arts. And I always try to make each of the action scenes count. I actually think that probably there are readers who expect the books to be more action packed, and they're more they actually have, I think, more in the way of tension as opposed to just pure action. Like I would like each of those action scenes to feel like they're surprising but also inevitable, because the tension has led these characters to a place where, of course, violence is the result or is the answer. And ideally, each of those scenes should feel different. So I don't want the action to feel like it's repetitive in any way, because every single violent confrontation is occurring for its own narrative reasons and in its own context. So there's a different feel to a sudden assassination attempt versus a very kind of ritualized duel versus a sudden terrorist attack versus a emotional confrontation between two characters who lose their temper with each other. Like each of those is very different, and if I can like evoke an emotion out of them that makes the readers understand why that's happening, and in a way that they're already bought into, so they're not like, well, what's going on, because they're already primed for it, even if like it's unconscious that they're primed for it, then I think that helps make them flow more smoothly. I also try to like do a lot of the world building in a way that when the action happens, you're not questioning why those things work. So like, for example, in Jade City, there's a scene early on where I take the reader to the academy where the Green Bones train in their Jade discipline. So I can, in a sort of low stakes way, explain like how Jade works and what are the different skills and how does this magic, like what are the powers they have, so that when it actually does come up in combat, then you're not like questioning what's going on. And then I have like a big action set piece that's set in a restaurant, but you've been to this restaurant a couple other times already. Like, like I've already in low stakes way introduced you to like this restaurant and how important it is and like what it feels like and who the order is. And so you're sort of already bought into it. And then when violence breaks out, you're already kind of emotionally invested in it because I primed you to be that way. That's how I try to make it work out.
I'm like, oh no, the squid balls, save them. I think that something that you do really brilliantly with violence in these books, also that is totally, in my experience, divorced from traditions of like Western action media, like popular blockbuster action movies, is that violence isn't just set up to feel inevitable and understandable, but every moment of violence, and I'm sure this comes from your own experience with martial arts and with fighting, experiences with real actual violence are crucible moments for people. I mean, when we experience violence, it changes things inside of our brains and inside of our bodies. And I find that every single moment of violence throughout these books carries through to the end of this last one. I mean, I in the last few chapters of this book, I was thinking about critical moments of violence in the first one. This is going to be a silly question. Was it hard to bring all that forward? I mean, it's so much for you to carry into the last bit of this last book, and yet you built this violence so well into all these characters and all of the plot movements that from page one of the first book, it feels like the end of this last one is inevitable.
So I recently started playing D&D, and I was talking to my husband about it because I'm enjoying it, but I was saying, it bothers me that you can have all these fights in D&D and you can just like take healing potion and get like better, and you're like back up to like your maximum hit points like the next day, because it makes like, even though the battles are fun, and maybe it's just because I'm currently a very low level like D&D player, but they don't feel like they have like lasting repercussions because they can be cured. But like it's not for violence to matter in the story, it can't be washed away. Like it can't just be like, okay, we're done with that and like that's resolved. In fact, it never actually really resolves something. It usually opens up a whole can of worms that will then ripple through the whole rest of the story. And I try to think of each of those violent moments as ones that have these rippling repercussions that just keep spanning out through like the rest of the narrative. So like nothing, if I take a scene, I think one of the things that bothers me about some Hollywood action movies is like there are fight scenes in there that you can take out and they wouldn't fundamentally change the story. And I would like to think that if you took any of the action scenes out of these books, that something that like the books would fall apart. Like every single scene is so tied to the other ones in terms of like what the repercussions are of these violent acts, that it would be a completely different story. But I also have the mindset that I use to write the action scenes. I also think I apply to the dialogue and the political scenes as well, which is something that I think I learned to do in the process of writing these books, because I hadn't written a book up until these that was so intricate in the like political subplots and the how much like maneuvering and scheming there was. And so I used the same principles when I was doing some of those political scenes, because ideally I could create business meetings that felt super tense, like felt like battles. I wanted to be able to do that, to have scenes where they're just talking, but you're just like stressed out because they're talking. So that was what I tried to do.
Absolutely nailed it. I was very stressed during all those scenes. Before I ask this next question, I do also want to remind everyone who's joining us that we are going to be taking audience questions in 15 minutes or so. There's a little Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. You can drop your question in there. And if you see other questions that you think are ones you'd like to see answered, you can upvote them to make sure we get to them. So make sure that you hop in there. Okay, so you talked a little bit about this in a beautiful essay that you wrote on Sticking the Landing, but talking about the way that you structured these books and all the thought that you put into it makes me really want to talk to you more about how you decided to tee up this last book, how you decided to make it a satisfying finish, which I can testify it absolutely is. But I would love to just talk with you more now about the research that you did, the approach that you took, and where you were coming from in how you decided to nail this so thoroughly well.
I brought it back really to like, what are these books about? And the spine of these books, because they have a lot of stuff going on in them, but at the heart of the books is this family story and the conflict that the Kaul family has with their rivals, the Mountain Clan. And that's that's the spine of the story. So for it to be a satisfying ending, I had to bring that spine to a natural conclusion that felt right and that felt earned. And that was really the thing that stuck in my mind the most was, there was going to be a lot of plot threads, and they all had to contribute in some way to that earned sense that I've told the story of this family, and in this specifically this generation of leaders in this family, and everything that transpired in the third book is really related to kind of how the characters that we met in the first book sort of reconcile their wielding of power and then passing on that power. So Jade City was really about like these characters stepping up and taking leadership, and then Jade War was about them like holding on to it, and then Jade Legacy is really about them establishing that legacy and passing their power on. And as a result, I knew going in Jade Legacy was going to be a long book, and I do feel like each of the 3 books in the trilogy should have their own character, even though they all work together to create like the uber story. Ideally, each one should also feel unique in its own way. And Jade Legacy was the contained story of conflict in this city, and that's how these characters came into power. And then Jade War expanded that to be an international story, because that was how the internet, like the plays that they made internationally, were how they hung on to power. And then Jade Legacy is about time, and it's about change, and it's about evolving and adapting and growing, and how both these characters and their culture and like the role of Jade in this world change. And so the only way I could tell it was by covering that amount of time. And I knew going in that was going to be a challenge. There's readers out there who are not going to like time skips no matter what you do. So I just kind of had to like, okay, well, how do I write this in a way that feels smooth to me, pacing wise, and covers the important elements, because I can't cover everything that happens in like 20 years. It would be impossible. It would be like a 3,000 page book. It's already like so it was already going to be long. So I had to break it down into pieces, because when I tried to think of the entire thing, it would just like broke my brain. It would just grind to a halt when I tried to hold it all in my mind. And I had to eat it like one bite at a time by breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces, and thinking of like, okay, what's the arc in this like first quarter of a book, and then what's the arc in like this next quarter, and how do they link together to form like larger arcs? And it was just it was a lot at times.
So just real easy, smooth process, no problem. just kind of spat the book out and then went about your day, and whew, glad that's behind you.
I mean, it wasn't a NaNoWriMo project, let's put it that way.
All right, I have actually something that I've been wondering since the start of these books, and it's something that it feels inevitable, but I want to understand why it feels so inevitable. These books, you absolutely could have written them if you had decided to, with no magic. You could have said, okay, I'm going to flex on Mario Puzo nonstop and write about a crime family. It's international politics. And they would have been brilliant books. The introduction of bioenergetic Jade, which is magic and science kind of together in a way that is so delicious to me as a reader, brings them up to a whole other level. It weaves in this completely other set of ideas and ideals and rules and laws. And I want to know why you decided to make this world that has magic in it. That you already answered this. It's because you're a world building junkie. I was going to say that has so many specific rules and such a background in history, and it's because you have a problem. And again, we can get you.
But also it ties into something you said earlier, which is because it's cool. It really comes down to, yes, these books have a whole bunch of world building to them, but it all started because of wish fulfillment. It all started because I was like, wait a second, like I train in martial arts and I cannot punch through concrete. This is super unfair. Like, why do I not have like the ability to run up a wall no matter like how many hours I put in at like the gym?
It does seem messed up.
Right. So it really started, the kernel of these books came about because I was like, well, what is the reason why these characters in the kung fu films can do stuff that I can't? Well, it's got to be magic. It's got to be something. And so that's how the Magic Jade came about, and then everything grew from that. So like it's so much, that speculative element is so much in the DNA of these stories because of the cool factor, and that's because of their birthplace being me wanting to have really awesome, cool kung fu powers too.
I think you deserve it. I think that you deserve kung fu powers, especially again after writing this much. You should at least get the punch through cement power.
I'm even wearing Jade, and I'm still, it
makes me glad I'm on the other side of a camera.
First Jade, yeah,
safe and sound. I mean, I think that's part of why I love the genre that we write in. I love speculative fiction because you can say, "Hey, wouldn't this be cool?"
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, it would.
Yes,
cool.
It would be. I think one of the wonderful things about being speculative fiction authors is like you can take literally any story that exists and just add a speculative fiction element to it, and it's immediately cooler.
It just improves it. Yeah, it just makes it better.
Like you can take anything, like Little House on the Prairie, and add aliens there, like Little House on the Prairie with aliens. Like that is instantly cooler.
It's just better. You just improved it. Okay, so next project that you're going to be pitching is Little House on the Prairie with aliens. I can't wait to read it. I recently had the opportunity to be at a conference with you where I behaved myself perfectly and in no way became the target of your ire by talking about how much I love these books. The conference theme was villains, and you gave a phenomenal talk about the villains in this book. Well, whatever, I was there too, don't worry about it. You talked about the villains that you write and the influence of your own personal background on them. I'm not going to make you improvisationally rehash the entire talk here.
Good, because I don't remember it.
But something you said a few minutes ago really connected with that in my mind, which is that you wanted the business conversations to be tense in this book, and I can only assume that you drew some on your own background in business for that. I'm wondering if you would like to talk just a little bit about the influence of that background, both on the incredible tension and stakes driving in these books, and also on the phenomenal villains that you write.
I think one of the ways that my background in business fed into these books is that I'm always thinking about the economic implications of the magic. And so I'm the sort of person who like asks, like, how are orcs paid? Like, are orcs unionized? Like,
if they're not, they better get
they really
unionized.
Ought to be. I mean, so
I feel like they've got a good case.
Yeah, and it's something that is often lacking a lot in a lot of traditional epic fantasy. Is like there's all these kings and grand schemes and so on, but like I like to get chunky into like the economics and the business side of things. And so the fact that like Jade was a resource that can be mined and then processed and distributed and sold and exported and is like part of the economy of this place and is this limited resource that other powers covet, and there's a black market for it. And of course there would be a scientific component where someone comes up with the drug that like allows other people to use this. Like all of those economic like second, third, fourth order effects are things that just fascinate me and that I want to pull into the story. And so that's why in the book you'll often see things like there's this big action set piece and then the next piece is like trade embargo. So like and I also wanted one of the themes that to be present in Jade Legacy to be the idea of organizational change and leadership, because there are the characters in these stories they really like organizational leaders. Like I think of Aitmata, who's the antagonist of my series, as she's like the CEO of like villains. Like she's just so I and yeah, so that's pretty much how that all feeds in, because I do want the world to feel very real and grounded, so that magic isn't just like magic. It's a thing that has political and economic ramifications, and all of, you know, the things like the cartel that controls it, and you know, the politicians that they have in their pocket and having to be diplomatic with them. Like all of those things, even if they're not like front and center, are always working in the background.
That's, I mean, that is capital W world building right there. It's not world building that asks one question, but world building that asks a million questions. And we can find doctors who can get you through this. Okay, I have one last question for you before I start pulling from our audience Q&A. As you well know, as authors, we love every moment of our jobs. Every instant of writing is a dream come true. There is no unpleasant moment, and you got to have so much fun writing 3 of these that I'm sure it'll be almost impossible to choose an answer to this. But I want to know, what is something that you have loved about writing and publishing these books and sharing them with the world?
Oh gosh. It's hard to encapsulate the whole experience in a way. I think probably I mean, honestly, it's the reactions that readers have to the characters that has been the most meaningful to me. I have lived with these characters for a very long time. I feel like I'm part of their family. I feel like I know them inside and out. I feel like I've grown old with them. I just have had these characters living in my head for years, and seeing the reactions of readers who also get really attached to these characters and feel like they're real people has been really gratifying, because I think I think our job is to tell a great story, and sort of the extra level is like people finish your story and then they want to they still think of these characters as real people after they finish the story, and that's some sort of magic stardust that you can't just call upon. It just, I think, happens when the muses align and you manage to put that magic out onto the page. So I think that's probably it, is that like I envisioned this story as having one main character, and that was the Kaul family. And each of the POV characters was one part of that protagonist unit. And they all had to like play their role, and really the magic of the story is in the relationships between those characters, which I have lived with for a long time, but now all the readers can experience too.
It really is something incredibly special when you find out that the characters that have been living just inside of your head for so long are also living inside someone else's head and heart. I have great news about our audience questions. If this is a subject that you like, they have got a lot of questions about your characters. Are you ready to jump in?
All right, hit me with some.
All right. We'll start you off easy. Who was your favorite character to write?
Oh, I've been asked this many times, and for the first 2 books I always punted because I was like, I don't want anyone to like assume anything. But my favorite character to write is Hilo. And he's my favorite character to write because for 2 reasons. First, he just came to me very clearly. I've spent a lot of time developing each of these characters. I know them equally well at this point, but he was the character that like just sort of very early on, I knew how he walked, I knew how he talked, I knew how he smoked, I knew how like what he would say in like a given conversation, like his cadence of his voice, like those things just sort of materialized easy for him, and I appreciated that as a writer. I was like, thank you, character, like you made my job very easier. And then the other reason why I always enjoyed writing him is because he is the most he's like the most pure embodiment of this world that I created and the Green Bone culture and its values, both its good sides and its not so good sides. And all the other characters have a more ambivalent relationship with that culture, whether it's Shay because she's a woman in a very male-dominated society and she left and she came back, or it's Andon who's adopted and biracial and gay and isn't sure where he fits, or whether it's Wen because she's a stone eye. So they all have some element that they struggle with, and Hilo's just like the pure Green Bone. And so like writing him was always like living fully in my made-up world.
He was really born for this particular place and time.
Yes.
I feel like when he showed up in the world, he was like, great, I nailed it. Same querent, would love to know who your least favorite character to write was. And if you don't have a least favorite character to write, I would like to know what character you would like to get into a fist fight with.
I really don't want to get into a fist fight with any of these characters. I would lose.
But you have your jade necklace now. You're safe.
Jeez. I mean, maybe Barrow, because like.
Well, this is perfect jumping point to another question. One of our audience members wants to talk about Barrow, about what he represents about Jade culture. I just love it every time he shows up on the page, because I'm like, oh, something bad's about to happen. Where did he come from for you?
So Barrow, I'm quite fond of Barrow. A lot of
you have a funny way of showing it.
I really do. So Barrow, Barrow was initially a framing device that I intended to be like a George R.R. Style minor character who shows up in the first chapter and like dies, or like it's very not like he was a way to enter the world, because if I had dropped the reader on page 1 into like Hilo or Lon's point of view, they already know how Jade works. They know the clans, like they know they are native to this world, and there was no elegant way to explain to readers how this world worked while in their heads. So Barrow was the solution to that. Yeah, exactly. As you know, Hilo, in our family, we use magic jade. So that was not going to work. And the way that my way around it was to have Barrow, this dumbass thief who just wants to get his hands on Jade. And through his very simple motivations, we would see what Jade does, why it's coveted, what the clans represent, and how they control it. So he was the entry point into the world. And then he walked onto the page and he just stayed there. And he was just so useful to me. So I enjoyed him so much because he was really outside of the clans. Like everyone else, all the other POV characters were enmeshed in the clans, and Barrow he is such an inflated view of himself, but he is truly an outsider. And so he could do all the like super sketchy street level, like disaster stuff that he got involved in. And it would all like feed back into the story in unexpected ways. And he was really useful narratively, and he also was really thematically resonant, because luck and fate and chaos are like such a big part of like the beliefs that these characters hold, and Barrow is kind of like chaos personified. And like he himself thinks of himself as like super lucky and unlucky, and like so he gets into so many. So he was just he's a great he he just had so many refreshing moments, because I would be with the other POV characters in the Kaul family, and they always have a lot going on. They have like their relationships and the politics and the rivalry in the mountain and the scheming and the fighting, and there's always a lot of balls to juggle when I was writing one of their chapters. And then I would get to Barrow, and it would just be like this refreshing like moment where Barrow only has one thing going on, and it's usually a disaster of some sort. And he has a particular voice, like the tone of his chapters is different. It's a Barrow chapter. And I knew every time I reached one that probably my readers were like, God damn it, it's Barrow. And like that just brought me a lot of joy.
With him, it's very, oh, how's he gonna get out of this one? Barrow's in another pickle. I love him. Thank you to the reader who asked that one, because I just love getting to spend time with him. Our audience member Michael asks, I love the way the locations play a major role, almost like another character in the narrative. What kind of research or experiences did you leverage to make the locations feel so authentic and lived in? Which, again, your dark passenger, your world building addiction, I'm sure plays a role.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wanted these places to feel like you could visit them. And the way that I tried to do that was to make them very specific in like their details, but also not tie them to any one place in our world. So like you can't say that John Loon is Tokyo or Singapore or Shanghai, or like it's not based on any one place, but I would like amalgamate a bunch of elements to create vibes. And so I would like research, I would look at maps of Hong Kong and Taipei and Singapore and Manila, and like I would look at like travel guides for those places and be doing a lot of research, and things like the typhoon shelters in Summer Harbor, like all of those little details would like kind of get pulled into my creation of those places. And then I needed to make sure each other location also felt distinct and felt recognizable, but also its own thing. So like when you go to Steppenland, that feels very different, and it kind of has a European air to it, without actually saying, oh, this is fantasy Europe, but it's clearly just the cues of like what you see and how it feels should feel different. And then when you go to Port Massey and Espenia, that clearly feels like a big Western coded city. So yeah, a lot of drawing from real life, but not just filing off the serial numbers. It's like filing off the serial numbers, grinding it into paste, mixing with the paste from another thing that you've ground the serial numbers off of, and then like stirring it into a slurry and then stamping it into a mold.
Delicious. No, just like the locations play a major role, your time periods play a major role. As you said, this spans quite a lot of time. And if I'm remembering right, you did a lot of research to ground your time periods in technology that was available and present in the slurry that you were working with. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. So I wanted to, well, I didn't specify like specific years with, like I didn't match up years in the Green Bone Saga to like years in our world. What I did though was I would like use cues from like roughly when technology was developing in our world to show passage of time. So like for example, you'll see, I don't think this is a spoiler, but in Jade Legacy, you'll see things like, oh, like this many years have passed and now you're in the weatherman's office and they're using like computers instead of typewriters. And then you see a flip phone make its appearance, and like the little advances that are happening in the background hopefully help establish this like passage of time so that it becomes, and one of the reasons why I set Jade City in a like pre-digital era was that I had then that like leeway of time, so that like by the time you got to like Jade Legacy, you could see it like catching up to our own era in terms of like technological advancement.
I love that, and I love that it's not tied to specific years. I love that it's just vibes through and through with these books. Okay, we have time for one last question, and this is one that is in the chat. It is also just a question that I love to close our events with. Can you talk about anything that you have read lately that you've loved?
Oh goodness. I have not read a lot lately because I've been launching a book. But right now I am reading Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. And I have an event with the co-authors next Tuesday. Yes. And
right.
I'm enjoying that quite a lot. It is about a con artist who infiltrates a noble family, and there's a lot of politics and also fashion. Yeah.
Okay, I'm in already. So that was Mask of Mirrors,
Yeah,
by M.A. Carrick, which I'm sure that our audience members can pre-order from Powell's right now. And I'm going to talk about a book that I read that I really loved recently. It's a book called Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. It is the closing book in the absolutely unparalleled Green Bone Saga. You can get Jade City Book 1, Jade War Book 2, and Jade Legacy Book 3, all from Powell's City of Books. You absolutely should. And then you should tell your family and friends not to try and talk to you for however long it will take you to read. I think we established about 8 inches of book total.
And I would be remiss if I did not tell our listeners to go out and get Echo Wife. That book still haunts me. It is so good. It is like sci-fi domestic thriller, and it's so good. So if you're watching this, please go get it.
Those are all the books you need to get from Powell's City of Books, along with every single other one that they stock. Powell's, thank you so much for hosting us. Fonda, thank you for inviting me to talk to you tonight. This was such an honor and a joy. And thank you, audience, for spending this hour with us.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Yeah, that was awesome. Awesome conversation, and appreciate it so much. So, and yeah, thank you for everyone for joining us. And please purchase a copy of Jade Legacy by visiting powells.com. Is it right here? Got that? So yeah, right there. Also, yeah, check out the Echo Wife as well. Got that in there. So, and yeah, and please, while you're there on powells.com, check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you again too. So, all right, thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Thank you. Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.